So we're going to start off today with our keynote speaker. We're very pleased and honored to have Dawn James join us. She comes to us from Deloitte Consulting, where she joined recently. She is the Managing Director of Sustainability Strategy and Transformation, which means that as Deloitte is doing its consulting to its clients in the energy and technology field, she is bringing in the perspective of helping them accelerate their sustainability journey. So she has 25 years of industry program management experience as both a geoscientist and as a systems leader. She was formerly Global Director for Industry Strategy for Energy and Sustainability, Director of U.S. Sustainability and Environmental Science Strategy at Microsoft. Her background, another thing, she was a research hydrologist at the U.S. Department of Interior. So for students out there thinking that your career path is linear, Dawn's going to tell you a different story of her career path. She has a master's degree in geoscience from California State University and a professional certificate in big data and predictive analytics from MIT. Among the various things that she's involved in that's specific to this domain, she's on the board of directors of Greentown Labs, one of the biggest startup accelerators in the clean tech space. So please give a warm welcome to Dawn James.
So thank you very much for that warm introduction, Reed. Let's see if this, let me get my direction here. There we go, yeah. So again, my name is Dawn James. Really excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about what I do and climate change investments, and really looking at what we see as an unprecedented opportunity for both corporations and also investors. So let me start out here. When we start thinking about systems, what are systems, right? Sometimes they're big, they're monolithic pillars. We think of systems like government, education, or private business. They have racial connotations and religious connotations. They're typically very expensive, they're complex, they're politically charged, and these systems are extremely difficult to change. But the thing about these large monolithic systems, rarely do they do everything or meet the needs for the people that those systems were meant to serve. So what happens? In the shadows, between the pillars, other systems grow in the cracks. This could be in the form of coalitions, special societies. In corporations, there are ERGs, employee resource groups. They can be things like government initiatives, women's groups, right? But the reason why they grow is because they serve a need. They're answering a call. So one of the things about these new systems that grow is that many times they take on a life of their own. Typically, they grow beyond the original intent as a stopgap. Sometimes they become unwieldy and just as large sometimes as the core pillars. But they don't always have the same security features or governance. And very typically, we see this in all industries and in governments and individual orgs, and they all point to the same core sentiment. And that is that we need to go faster, right? Organizations and the people that they serve can't wait for this monolithic development to solve all of the problems. They need solutions that can be designed and created by the people that are closest to the problem. So again, just to kind of put up who I am and my background, I know Reed kind of talked about it a little bit, but I'm a sustainability strategist, and I focus on digital transformation. I face the energy sector and the tech sector. I'm a geoscientist, and I've worked across many different industries. I started out as a geotechnical engineer working in construction, so my focus has been in the AEC sector, architecture, engineering, and construction. I started out in the field. hard hat and steel-toed boots. I'm on the board of directors for Greentown Labs, which is the largest clean tech incubator in the United States. I work a lot with startups. I work a lot with the government, looking at their initiatives and helping the private sector to take them up and enable and leverage them in the best way possible. I support a range of initiatives and solutions focused on sustainability, ESG, environmental science, and I always infuse a drumbeat of equity in the innovation that I support. I've worked all over the world, and I also really focus on articulating that value proposition at the convergence of industry and technology. So when we think about the purpose and why we're here, every time I get up on stage and I have an opportunity to address a group of people, I'm really grateful, right? Because we're facing an unprecedented time, not only for ourselves as individuals and our families, but as a species, right? I come from Houston. I was talking to some of you guys earlier today. I sit in Houston. I've been there for 10 years. I'm a mother. I have 2 young daughters, and we've gone through Hurricane Harvey. We've gone through the Great Freeze that happened several years ago, historic heat, hurricanes, and we've seen the infrastructure around us be completely rendered useless. And it doesn't matter if you're the CEO of a company or you work in the service industries, we are all impacted exactly the same. And it's critical that we recognize that climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's an economic issue, it's political, and it's absolutely a social issue as well. The costs of inaction at this point are simply too high. And with severe economic impacts that range from property damage and supply chain disruptions, it's important that we figure this out. This is what I consider the ultimate group project, and we have to learn how to work together. There's an increasing recognition among corporations and businesses, investors and governments that the risks associated with climate change, like I mentioned, are not just environmental and financial. And this is driving a demand for climate-related financial disclosure and risk management. And we're also seeing new investment strategies in low-carbon technologies and infrastructure. We're seeing a very strong shift in public opinion towards this greater concern about climate change and a willingness to take action. It's reflected in the growing number of climate policies that are being implemented, and we're seeing this globally. We're seeing it nationally and on a subnational level. And we're also seeing this stark increased attention that's being paid to climate issues in the media and across the greater public arena. So just to dive into the numbers just a little bit, and I'm sure most of us in this room have seen some of these numbers before, but it's important to look at them so that we understand what's at stake. So from a financial standpoint, right, analysis suggests that insufficient action to address climate change could cost the United States $14.5 trillion over the next 50 years. Research also suggests that coordinated climate action could increase the size of the world's economy by $43 trillion between 2021 and 2070. So when we start thinking about what does this mean and where are the areas that we need to address and where is the imperative most stark? Across organizations and governments, what we're seeing is decarbonizing the economy is number one on the list of priorities. And that involves transitioning to a low carbon energy system, promoting energy efficiency and conservation, and also the investment strategies to new and traditional energy sources. We're seeing increased investment across wind, solar, geothermal. And not only are we focused on mitigation strategies, but adaptation strategies as well. There's a lot of studies that talk about the ebb and flow and how we actually coordinate efforts between mitigation and adaptation strategies. So some of the adaptation strategies that we're seeing that involves building resilience, and also, building resilience to impacts to climate change, like some of the flooding issues. We get a lot of flooding in Houston. I also lived in Miami, where flooding is a big problem, Louisiana. Mitigation or adaptation strategies to some of the heat waves that we're seeing and the power that's necessary. Also, measures through improving infrastructure and land use planning. In my career, like I mentioned, I started out my career in the AEC sector, and so I consider myself a bit of an infrastructure wonk. I think that improving our infrastructure is going to be probably the biggest effort that we see coming from the government and also organizations, because one, that's one of the biggest areas that's contributing to greenhouse gases, but it's also one of the areas that crosses both mitigation and adaptation. We're also looking at how we're going to change our economic systems to support a low carbon or a net zero economy. So we're mobilizing different types of financial vehicles that involve leveraging the public and private finance to support climate change. And we're seeing that through the government, and we're also seeing that in the private sector. And it's interesting, Deloitte, so I mentioned that I worked for Deloitte. We came out with a CXO report a few months ago, and I think it was probably around 90% of CEOs mentioned that an equitable energy transition is a strategic priority. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. When we start talking about ESG, many times we focus on the E, right? And we don't really put that S lens, that societal lens over everything we do. And I have to say that that is one of the most important parts of the strategy, because those hit hardest by climate change are the ones that need the transition the most. So the roles of business in the climate action tapestry is really compelling. And it's clear that by embracing sustainability and climate and equity, organizations are driving towards a specific type of value, right? And I explain this a lot of the time because people ask me, are organizations, do they really care? What is it? Is it greenwashing? Are they really putting together these strategies? Like I said, I face the energy sector. I work mostly with oil and gas companies. And there is a reason, right? It's not just because it's the right thing to do. Part of it has to do with brand and reputation, right? And there is a number behind brands that have strong purpose in their strategy, right? So brands with strong purpose are 6 times more likely to be protected in the face of negative publicity. 58% of organizations with inclusive business cultures and practices are more likely to improve their reputations. There's also a sales and innovation component. Sustainability marketed products compared to conventionally marketed products are seeing a 28% premium. So you might have heard people talk about the green premium. There's a revenue component to being more sustainable. We also see numbers around capital and market valuation, right? Highly inclusive companies are more likely to hit their financial target goals by up to 120%. And then we also see it from a workplace and a workforce perspective. 78% of people would prefer to work for sustainability-driven companies. And I see that myself. I mentioned a little bit of my career trajectory, and it's absolutely true, right? People care now a lot more about having purpose-driven work, right? And I know one of the things that I talk about quite a bit to my mentees is, to me, peace of mind is the new success, right? And many people believe the same thing. Having purpose-driven work is very important, and companies see that from a workforce perspective. And lastly, when we think about risk mitigation, right? 800 million global jobs have high vulnerability to climate change extremes and economic transition impacts. That impacts a lot of people, right? The US economy could gain $3 trillion over the next 50 years if it accelerates towards a low emissions growth path, right? So we're seeing a very high value proposition for companies to move towards net zero and to take on sustainability initiatives as part of their business model and strategy. And I always joke, I've been in this industry for over 25 years, worked in the environmental science sector for a very long time, and this is literally the first time that I've ever been popular. And that has to do with the opportunity that's at stake. So to shrink that next net zero gap, there's public and private organizations that'll need to overcome persistent and systematic barriers that have historically limited the much needed investment in climate technology. So according to the IPCC's report, we need to invest more than $1.6 trillion per year between 2020 and 2050. And that's in order for us to transition to a net zero emissions economy. And it's interesting when I start thinking about these numbers because it's an imperative that we figure out these investment strategies. We figure out where the priorities in our communities and in our society are, and that we spend the money, right? So in terms of the areas for action, like I mentioned, it's important that we come up with that regulatory framework and also that we put in the right, so like I mentioned, there's that target spend of $48 trillion, and there's that estimated target of 38 trillion. So today we've only spent up to 10. We're on track to spend $10 trillion, and we need another 38. So we see that governments are putting together that regulatory framework and making sure that the incentives are there so that we can put together the assistance that's needed across both the public and private sectors. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the laws and acts that have been put in place over the last several years. And they're really meant, there's a lot more than just these three, but I'm going to talk about these trio of laws that have been implemented to accelerate clean energy and innovation, also economic growth and emissions reduction. And these three laws, they represent this significant step forward. So like I mentioned, not only does the private sector have this imperative, right, that is both economic and looking at the future of their business and being able to be resilient, but we're also seeing that the government right now is really enacting these laws to enable that transition. So first, there's the CHIPS and Science Act, and that came out quite a while ago. And it's really about increasing that investment in cutting-edge technologies, and it's focused on semiconductors and quantum computing. And it's funny, Reed mentioned that I used to work for Microsoft, and I talked with companies across all of their prioritized sectors, and people always wanted to talk about all of the really fancy technology like quantum computing and blockchain. And it's interesting because that conversation always went back to data. People ask me about, what do I think about AI and some of the new things that are coming out with regenerative AI. Everything is about data. It's about how well we're able to collect the data, analyze the data, and then be able to transform that data into useful insights. And that's the same thing when we're talking about this cutting edge technology. When I worked as a geoscientist when I was in school, we used to talk about garbage in, garbage out, and that is a data issue, right? So the CHIPS and Science Act is really about investing in these type of technologies to improve energy efficiency and also the deployment, right? And so that is really key as well. So not only investing in the new technologies and innovation, but we have to think about the deployment and the scale model. So also, the second bill or second act is that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is really important. And that provides that critical funding for infrastructure projects. And like I mentioned, I think that the government and also the private sector realize that infrastructure is really that engine that's going to drive the net zero and reduction of carbon emissions across the board. And this law invests in electric vehicle infrastructure, which is very much needed if we're going to switch to more of electric infrastructure and transportation. It also expands public transportation options, and it also provides more resiliency to the energy systems. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm going to double click on that a little bit. But basically, the IRA aims to reduce inflation by promoting competition and innovation across various industries. And this law is really related to climate action because it supports energy innovation and economic growth. And that promotes that market competition and reduce the costs for energy. And so why it's important to reduce those costs, it's so that we can increase the deployment of renewable energy and also be able to reduce emissions. So that's important. So in my job, when I look at startups, one of the things that I do is help startups to find corporate sponsors and help corporate sponsors find innovative startups to invest in. I did that quite a bit for Microsoft, and also to vet some of the technology if I have an expertise in the science that it uses. And one of the biggest things when I coach startups is around that deployment and scale model. And it's the same thing when I help corporations with their strategy around incorporating this new innovation, because that's the purpose, right? It's wonderful to have a great idea. It's wonderful to come up with new innovation, but we must figure out how do we leverage that so we can get it to the people that need it the most. So double-clicking on the IRA, the DOE also has the Loan Programs Office, or the LPO, and the LPO's mission is to provide loans and loan intents for innovative emerging energy projects and technologies across the U.S. And they look to invest in projects and technologies that otherwise may not likely receive funding from the private lenders, and that's due to risk. So I do work with the LPO office, so does other practices within Deloitte. And they have done a tremendous job, and the IRA has infused, I want to say it's over $126 billion, I want to say is what they got. So it started out as part of the Energy Policy Act in 2005, and then the IRA has infused more funds into the LPO, right? So to date, they've issued $36 billion in loans. And then with the IRA, here it is, they've put in, the LPO's lending budget has increased to $400 billion. So that if you think back to that chart that I had of how much we need to spend versus what we've spent and where we need to get to, the loans through the LPO is a big part of that and how we're going to get to those numbers for the investment that's necessary for us to get to where we're trying to go. So the IRA plays a critical role in positioning the United States to achieve its greenhouse gas reduction targets. And if the IRA does what it has been prescribed to do and gets enabled in the way that we're trying to enable it through the private sector. They're looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 42% by 2030. It's very aggressive, and it's going to need the help of the private sector to be able to do it. So these legislation there's a range of measures that they're aimed to promote clean energy and reducing carbon emissions, and it includes tax incentives for electric vehicles, renewable energy production, and more recently at CERAWeek in Houston, the Secretary Granholm, she announced the new initiative coming out of the IRA. The pathways to commercial liftoff. And the goal of that, and there's a couple of new articles that just came out actually today, this morning, and yesterday around it. I think they finally officially launched it yesterday. So pathways to commercial liftoff. And that's all around reducing the dependence on fossil fuels and accelerating net zero goals. And the goal also with a number of these initiatives is to come up with a common roadmap, right? I was just appointed to the National Petroleum Council, which is part of the DOE, and they've asked private sector subject matter experts to come in and advise on some of the societal impacts and considerations around some of the reduction in emissions initiatives. And that's similar to what they're launching right now with the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff. They're looking at how can we accelerate these programs, right? How can we promote the renewable energy production? How can we look at the industrial sector, create more energy efficiency? So according to the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, there's $369 billion in climate and clean energy investments. I like this bubble map because it really gives you a little bit of an idea of how much and where they're really focusing some of these monies and which industries are being targeted as the priorities. So you can see that $92 billion in clean energy investment, also the $80 billion in clean energy and infrastructure, and then the $42 billion in residential energy efficiency. And like I mentioned, I kind of keep saying this over and over again, but the lever that is going to really drive the the flywheel is what we kind of talk about in industry. The flywheel effect is infrastructure. It's infrastructure and energy. So you see this theme kind of reoccurring. And the IRA is meant to have a positive impact on the economy. It's meant to create jobs in the clean energy sector. It's also meant to transition jobs from the fossil fuel industry. I come from that industry, and there's many very talented engineers and scientists that can very easily transition into a green energy economy. And like I mentioned, having that purpose-driven work is a priority for most people. So double-clicking a little bit on the 5 sectors that the IRA is focused on. One is power, right? Having that renewable energy power production, having the lowest cost for clean energy around the world. That's going to spur the private industry to be able to invest and utilize it more. The transportation sector is huge, right? They're looking at that accelerated EV adoption. Also, across industry, being able to boost that domestic production of specific energy sources, improved economics around the technologies for carbon capture, so CCUS, and also the direct air capture. I'm seeing this within energy companies or oil and gas companies that are sincerely changing their business model. There's steps that it has to go through, but watching some of the super majors heavily invest in direct air capture and also decarbonizing their operations is a step forward. Like I mentioned, the AEC sector, so the built environment, and looking at some of the commercial building retrofits. HVAC systems are huge, lighting across residential areas, and then of course the agricultural industry, agriculture and land use, it's huge. Those are the priority areas, and it's good for me to see the government focusing on those areas. And just to kind of round it out here, I want to focus a little bit on the technology and the value chain that we see in some of these high impact areas of technology and how that's going to be used to accelerate the clean energy transition. So one is looking at the costs of clean energy. That's one of the things that spurs the economic model so that we can have faster deployment and we can have greater scale. Mentioned I came from a big tech company, and it's the big tech companies that we're seeing that are driving a lot of this change. They are the companies within the United States that are some of the largest corporate purchasers of clean power. And by reducing the costs of energy or clean energy, it'll be able to benefit those companies in being able to purchase more, having larger PPAs and VPPAs. Also, from a technology standpoint, we're seeing energy management software and being able to expand that market. That's one of the things that I did work on, looking at the platforms that help from a predictive maintenance standpoint if we're looking at windmills. And also, I was part of the project for Northern Lights and in Europe that is a massive CCUS project, and being able to provide the digital platform that tracks the molecule, excuse me. So making sure that you track the molecule through transmission and that it's buried for a geologically significant period of time. How do we ensure that that happens, right? So all of those are digital problems. Those are software and platform problems, right? Also looking at clean energy hardware, you know, and being able to infuse investment into the developers of hardware. And, you know, like I mentioned, I'm on the board of Greentown Labs, but also there's a lot of other incubators out there that specialize in hardware production. That's a big deal. Also looking at the supply chain costs, being able to look at lower cost to clean transportation. And when we focus on, again, I'm going to hit the buildings and infrastructure again, improving building efficiency. There's a lot of technology that goes into that. There's solar heat, geothermal for heating and cooling, and HVAC systems, and then looking at retrofitting and upgrading energy efficiency in buildings. And then also, like I mentioned, the IRA does a lot from an increasing tax liability standpoint. There's a carrot and a stick kind of philosophy there. And then lastly, looking at that technology value chain, and I think that that can't be understated as well. As we're moving towards accelerating green technology, there are inputs to that technology, and we need to figure out that supply chain and ethically sourcing these minerals that go into that. So virgin raw materials are part of that input. Being able to recycle those raw materials, the manufacturing side of things, that's a very hard to abate sector, and then also the transportation logistics of those minerals. And then looking at that downstream outputs, again, we have transportation and logistics. How do we decarbonize that? The retail partners, also the consumers and customers. And lastly, how do we recycle and infuse circularity into everything that we're doing? Okay, so just as far as the future of technology in the industry, cloud everything as a service is huge. We've seen the advent of that. I've seen it in my lifetime. Nobody is using CD-ROMs anymore. Everything is in the cloud. Everything is SaaS operated, SaaS, PaaS, XaaS, right? Like it's all the same, right? It has all of these cloud implications, right? And that is what we're looking at as continuation into the future. Also, supply chains of the future. We all experience the ramifications of supply chains disruptions. Companies now, in a semi-post-COVID world, companies are looking how to have more resilient supply chains. They're proactively preparing for a future of uncertainty, so they're putting uncertainty into those models, and also looking to be able to infuse this idea of systematic risk into the system. The next generation of hybrid workforce, right? We've all experienced being at home and having to switch very quickly to this hybrid at-home environment. And there is a public sentiment around figuring that piece of the puzzle out. And then also some of the sustainability pressures. Companies are seeing that there is a technological component to being able to advance the sustainability agenda. So that's, critical from the growing pressures of stakeholders, and then also from a monitoring, tracking, and reporting standpoint. So just to kind of wrap up here, I think that we have a call to action, right? And I'm gonna kind of leave you with the things that are most important to me. Number one, in everything that we do in all of our interactions, and when we go back and do our jobs every day, it's important that we add empathy into what we're doing. Empathy makes you a better inventor. It makes you better at how you imagine the future. And I think that we all have a responsibility for how we imagine a future that is just and equitable for everybody. So, I'm passionate about innovation and infrastructure, industry, and how we use technology to make a positive impact in the world. And it's important that I talk about energy equity and the importance of infusing these societal considerations into all of these sustainable efforts, right? It's at the core of what we're doing, right? Energy equity, it means that all people should have access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy. It's not a nice to have. It's not only if you have money. It's a right. Everybody should have it, right? And it's not the case, right? It's not the case for communities all over the United States. It's not the case for communities around the world. But it's a critical issue that we have to address, and we have to have that responsibility to reimagine how we build a more sustainable and just world, right? So sustainability isn't just about decarbonization and reducing our carbon footprint or using renewable energy. We also have to consider these social impacts, right, across these businesses and operations. When I go to work, when I talk to corporations and C-suites and reimagine their business models and structure, I think about the people that are hardest hit and what that implies to the work, the technology, where they're locating sites, right? Air quality next to a direct air capture production, right? All of those things matter. We have to ensure that the products and services are accessible and affordable to everyone. That includes EV, when we start thinking about electrification and infrastructure retrofitting. And this is regardless of socioeconomic status or geographic input. We are in the midst of a dramatic shift, right? We all feel it. And we have to prioritize energy equity and consider these societal impacts as we're reimagining our economic systems, as we're reimagining our business operations. And when we do that, we will create a more just and equitable world. And we'll also create more long-term value across our society. So thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dawn. That was a great keynote to really set the stage for today. We have time for just a couple of questions from the audience, if anybody has any. Yes.
Don, I've heard that there are some people out there that are trying to equate ESG with a woke agenda, which really bothered me when I heard that. Do you have any thoughts on how that can be offset?
Well, like I mentioned, systems are very politically charged, right? So to me, woke just means you're not asleep, right? So I think that ESG is an imperative, right? And if we break it down, we're talking about the environment, which we all share, the societal agenda, which we all share, and how do we govern that, right? So, I mean, if I'm just to kind of speak from my heart here, I don't really understand the question, right? Because what does it mean, right? There's the science, and then there's kind of political rhetoric. So, and they're not necessarily the same.
Hi, Don. Thanks for your talk today. That was great. In your comments, you referred a couple of times to you called them hard to abate or difficult to abate sectors. Mm-hmm. Can you dig into that a little further? Which are the sectors that you have in mind, and which do you think are the sort of the hardest sectors?
Yeah, there's a lot of work on that, and usually they're talking about the manufacturing sector, the energy sector, and infrastructure. And from my perspective, what they're talking about are legacy systems, critical assets that are part of those sectors that are very old. When I think about some of the type of machines in the energy sector, they were built. Some of them were built in the 50s, 60s. Sometimes earlier, some of the manufacturing equipment is from like World War II, and it hasn't changed, right? And there's a lot of issues with the maintenance of those machines. There's only a couple companies in the world that can manufacture the parts to redo those systems. In the infrastructure sector, there's a lot of things that are legacy systems, and because of that, they're difficult to change, and they're also based on the Industrial Revolution and, not really having a consideration for the carbon emissions and that sort of thing. So that's why they're called hard to abate sectors, but they're also the critical sectors to our civilization, right? The energy sector is the engine that keeps literally the lights on, right? So it's not a matter of turning it off, just as it's not a matter of just turning it on, right? It's going in there, understanding where are the priorities within those sectors, what can we change today, what has to be pushed out 3 to 5 years or 10 years, right? And then, of course, the investment in those sectors is really important, and changing the mindset, and then also it's never about throwing people away. And I think that that's something that people need to move on from. It's about transition. It's about reskilling and coming up with new ways to understand how we can apply those skill sets to be able to participate in a new green or net zero economy.
Thanks for the good questions, everyone. That's all we have time for today, but please give a round of applause for Dawn for this great keynote.
Thank you.